if you take a 10, 20, 30-year view out, everything has been through multiple cycles of hot and not hot. But when you're in a hot phase, as one would assume by some of the stakeholders that we just elucidated, then are you able to capitalize on that goodness and build growth and momentum? But at the same point in time, when you're in a down phase of a wave, when you still have not peaked, you are actually you're riding towards the wave, then are you getting everything right in your DNA, in your operations, in your team, in your philosophy to be able to ride that wave that is going to come also? This is usually a tricky one because this only boils down to having adequate resources. Resources includes money, resources includes time, resources includes mental bandwidth. That's it. If you have a combination of these three, you can keep on working long enough up until you reach that next wave or the set of waves or all one ginormous tidal wave.
Hello and welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. I'm Roshan Karyappa. If this is your first time here, welcome aboard. We curate insights from India's best founders, operators, and investors. Learn what it takes to build and scale a startup. At the time of this recording, late 2022, we're all living through a funding winter, and that makes it all the more important to have alternate modes of financing. Anurakt Jain noticed in his previous stint as an investor that there were a wide range of businesses that weren't being served by conventional VCs. And so he set out to build Klub, a fintech platform that is pioneering revenue based finance for some of the most loved consumer brands around. In this conversation, I speak to Anurakt about what he's learned from his stints as an investor, operator, and now a founder. Some of the nuances of the space in which he operates, including building a moat, acquiring customers, dealing with regulation, and so on. And finally, we end with advice for founders on how they should navigate this slowdown. This was a fascinating chat, and I'm sure you'll like it. So let's get into it. This episode of the Startup Operator Podcast is brought to you by Park Avenue. Hey, Anurakt, welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you so much, Roshan, for having me over. It's an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, I've been excited about this conversation for a while. We've gone back and forth, but I'm so glad that we could finally make it. Yeah, so thank you again. Anurakt, I mean, I've had investors on my podcast who transitioned into founders, and I think, they do have an unfair advantage, right? In the sense that you have seen the market at a sort of an abstraction layer, and you've kind of figured out various business models within this market. And so when you do decide to start up, you have a very good sense of how these business models pan out, right? I mean, not like the typical sort of a product founder who kind of chases a problem and a solution right afterwards. So I'd love to start there. If you could talk about having been on both sides of the table, right? Your perspective as an investor and then having transitioned as a founder, and how that sort of impacts you in your day to day today.
Absolutely. No, Roshan, happy to speak about that. I'm actually going to add in a quirk first of all. I think I've sat on three sides of the table, which is very weird. There is the investor side, there is the founder side, but I will add on one more side, which is an operator side. What I mean by an operator side is working in a high growth startup is an experience which is absolutely unparalleled also, which is very different from being an entrepreneur or being an investor. So working at InMobi as an intrapreneur, building things at InMobi is also a third dimension. Happy to go down that rabbit hole if you like, but for now I'll constrain myself to the two sides of investor and entrepreneur. So two or three dimensions, and I am going to speak about them candidly because we finally started seeing investors shun their investing careers and then get into the operating side as an entrepreneur. And a lot of times I've heard the argument, hey, you might have seen multiple business models, so things might be a lot more clearer. You know what works, what doesn't work. It all boils down to something that is even more tangible, even more real, in that building a startup is hard, regardless of your background. It does not matter whether you've been an investor. In fact, at times I'd argue it's a slight disadvantage. There are advantages as well. It's just a startup takes so much out of you. A startup forces you to think along so many mental dimensions and frameworks that if you are not committed behind the journey 100%, no background works for you. And I'd argue more like Steve Jobs that you can always look backwards and connect the dots. So, regardless of what your journey is, regardless of how you've gotten to being an entrepreneur or a founder or solving a problem, you have to feel and associate with the problem very deeply, because building a startup is hard. It will take you down to very, very dark places. And if you truly don't associate with the problem, you will burn out, which is a secondary challenge, in that once you are an investor, you actually become a cynic. Investors build muscles to disparage and to understand not just different business models, but different kinds of companies within the same business model, right? Because as an equity investor, you have to, what one would call, back the winner that's going to return manyfold the fund. When you are trying to actually not just distinguish between business models, but distinguish between companies, you become a classical cynic. You're always used to saying, oh, this will not work. Oh, that will not work. This is wrong with this founder. That is wrong with this particular company. And many a times I've seen a lot of investor friends struggle with this, because it's very easy to punch holes. You take a business model, bring the Amazons, Metas of the world, Googles of the world, and you and I can absolutely punch holes there as well. The harder part is building something. And so, how do you take that cynic mindset, modify it such that the cynicism becomes healthy, that it forces you to challenge your assumptions over and over again? That's a fair bit of unlearning to do, because you're no longer solving for the best company with the best business model that returns manyfold to the fund. Now, there is obviously the advantageous side, that you start seeing how the die is cast on both sides, in that there is a certain objective that investors have, there is a certain objective that entrepreneurs have. More often than not, they are aligned, but there are times that they are misaligned. And one has to understand that the investing business is also, at the end of the day,
A
someone's
business.
bread and butter. It's a business. People have to return money back, and that to manyfold back to people who have given them money as well. So it's also a business that does take a toll on investors. They are not trying to be harsh, they are not trying to be unfair, they are not trying to go against entrepreneurs. That's not the intention or the motto there. A lot of people are genuine. A lot of people truly want to help. A lot of people don't have a lot of arrogance about them. That's the startup, that's the investor ilk that is very startup friendly, very founder friendly. And if you can hang on to those good sides, hang on to the good sides of seeing why you need to test certain assumptions very deeply, then that makes for a good entrepreneur. But there is no causality, there is no association whatsoever. The only thing that stands out for an entrepreneur over and over again, apart from a bunch of things which enough studies have called out, is resilience. You have to stick around with the problem long enough, but investor backgrounds are not always helpful. It just can be a double-edged sword.
Yeah, one is never quite prepared, right? Given any background. And one of those first learnings that you have as a founder is to recognize the VC business as a business itself, right? I mean, and realizing that, hey, I mean, startup growth and, the VC funding as such, right? As such, it does not have to be 100% congruent. It sometimes is never is, right? So yeah, that and the fact that being cynical is like a day job as an investor, right? I mean, because you have to find that one person, that one winner. But that may not be the case as a founder. I mean, you have to be that eternal optimist, and whereas others may not factor in that execution, you have to sort of back yourself and say that, hey, I mean, I'm going to join the dots and I'm going to take this forward, right? So yeah, very well said. I want to go back to the operator bits that you mentioned, right? The third sort of hat that you spoke about, and I think that's a very key thing. You've been a VP and GM at InMobi earlier. InMobi, as all of us will know, was perhaps India's first unicorn, very well celebrated, and they've had their ups and downs and in betweens for the last 10 plus years. Fairly legendary company, right? I mean, what was it like being part of that early sort of founding team and working with those folks?
Yeah. So in my case, Roshan, I actually did not join InMobi early on in the journey. I joined the company much later on in the journey. But interestingly, I joined the company as an intrapreneur. So I was part of a founding team that spun out two new business verticals, one of which has become a unicorn called Glance. So extremely privileged and honored that I could be a part of a team that is building something new, that is trying out a new vector, and that vector also builds out into something large and meaningful for the core business. So from that standpoint, it was an absolutely transformative journey. But going back to your question, what the operator side teaches is that building a business is not just about the concept, it is so much about scaling up that business into a viable economic opportunity. And therein lies another dichotomy in that I can assure you again, we can think of enough and more problems. We're smart people, we'll come up with solutions. Some of these solutions we can even find concept market fit and product market fit to it also. The challenge is when you move out of that 0 to 1 into 1 to 10, and importantly into 10 to 100, each stage and scale requires a different level of changing perspectives, changing how the organization is set up for that execution, changing how you are going to evolve your own mental models and of your leadership to be able to accommodate for that growth. That is something that India and startups in India are just learning. We've had startups about 15 years back as well. A lot of them achieved their glory, but I'd argue that product startups, true product startups in numbers, actually just started out as a very recent phenomenon, 5, 7, 8 years back. And that you see in the number of unicorns getting created, that you see in the number of product ideas that are getting generated. But how do you scale at each incremental level is a whole new journey, which an operator mindset teaches you. And I'd argue that an entrepreneur fails if they are not able to switch into that operator mindset, because the 0 to 1 is still possible. 1 to 10, you will brute force through smarts, but 10 to 100 is an operational machinery. And machineries work very differently from innovation. And so that dichotomy of saying this is my innovation muscle and this is my execution muscle is something that needs to be applied rigorously as startups switch. A lot of time we go through whiplashes. Right now we're going through a whiplash of downturn, right? So you see a lot of startups down ramping. And we see this whiplash over and over and over again. That's because we're not built for a gradual scale. We are very much built for what's the flavor of the season. We still haven't seen enough cycles as a startup community to be able to build gradually, build for the longer term. We will get there, do not get me wrong, but that's probably that distinction between an entrepreneur and an operator mindset. We've just started seeing our first set of large, profitably operational businesses come out of the Indian startup ecosystem.
Yeah, I think that playbook for scaling people, product, or process is only just getting started. Like you mentioned, right? I think maybe about 5 to 8 years old. Because, I mean, in the early days, I mean, I've been with startups for the last 15 years. I think in the early days, I mean, you would perhaps look at, the companies in the valley, but then the context was very different, right? I mean, marketing there perhaps, doesn't work the same way as here, right? And that was a key difference as well. Why did you pick revenue based financing? I mean, what was it about that? I mean, of course I can make like a lot of arguments for it. I mean, given that we need alternate forms of financing, and India is like famously credit starved and so on and so forth. But still, why revenue based financing? What about it appealed to you so much that you said you're going to stake the next 10 or 15 or 20 years of your life on this?
Yeah. And like all other uh, stories, this story did not start off saying, oh, we found this massive concept, let's go after it. Or another way that a lot of companies are founded, let's look at what is the US playbook or a Western playbook or even a Chinese playbook and then apply that to India. None of that. We were building a consumer brand. So literally, Club's genesis lies in a consumer brand. And as we were researching more about the consumer brand, we came across the problem of capital. Please note that this is pre-COVID, when consumer businesses would not get funding. And so we kept on thinking about this problem in that great products, good founders, good margins, good customer stickiness and repeat behavior is not getting rewarded and recognized. And it hit a very raw, tender nerve that we've experienced all throughout as investors, all throughout as enablers in the startup ecosystem. uh, as an investor, you always feel sadness when you do pick out a company but you would have spoken with all the 4 or 5 others as well. And you know that these are great founders, great founding teams. There's nothing wrong with the business model or with the team. It's just that you have to choose one. You have to pick one. That's just the way the venture capital industry is designed.
And folks could be at various stages of their journey as well, right?
Absolutely. And so there are companies that are in my own anti portfolio, and you'd like, seriously, you passed on this opportunity, but that was the fund mandate. What can I do? So there are obviously a lot of challenges associated with providing capital to businesses. And so it was a very, very, as I say, a tender nerve for us. It always hit us very, very deeply. Around the same time when capital for consumer businesses was coming out as a problem, we came across the term revenue based financing in Western markets, in the US business more specifically. And my co founder and I, we were just, as is thinking about multiple ideas, said, hang on, this sounds interesting. Like, why don't we have any revenue based financing in India? That it makes no sense. Now, please note that the company that we researched was doing revenue based financing for SaaS businesses. So we could easily extrapolate it as to why it works or doesn't work for SaaS in India. But we kept on with the problem saying, why not for consumer businesses? It just makes sense. Everything about the underlying dynamics of the product, the underlying dynamics of the industry, the underlying dynamics of how businesses are becoming more data oriented and digital in nature, how the government is pushing for more digitization, all of it stacks up. So the underlying macro seems right. We can't be the only ones thinking about it. And sure enough, we were wrong in that there was another 800-pound gorilla in the US called Clearco that we had no idea about. But the advantage of such shoddy research is that we built it grounds up. We knew we could not take a business model in the US and then copy that in India. It would not work, it would not scale. So we built this in a very different flavor altogether. We built this in a marketplace model. We built this in a model saying we need to have different pools of capital on the platform, largely because this would never scale up otherwise. India does not have enough institutional liquidity like the Western markets, like the US. So we would actually cap out. We would not be able to journey with founders and businesses as they scale up. And again, we're coming from a different place, right? We want to enable more of these startups, these businesses as they scale. So that's why we chose a very different construct of building out. So much so that I can share this as a precursor to the last question. I had investors laugh at me in my face. And that to me was the sure shot sign that we are onto something. I do say it with a pinch of satisfaction, in that it is a complex business model. It is a complex choice that we undertook, but we are not early on in our professional or entrepreneurial journeys, which is why we could take a longer term bet. We could take a 10, 15, 20-year out bet to say, this makes intuitive sense. We know we can build it in this particular way. Here is my 10, 20, 30-year plan about how to build this business. Obviously, you don't share that with investors all the way through, otherwise they will go mad. But it made sense because it was just something that we could not do back in our days as investors. We did not fund enough worthy businesses, enough worthy entrepreneurs. And to this day, I have enough and more friends who did not get the funding that they deserved. The last thing probably I will just say is also something called concept market fit, in that you're trying out different ideas and theses and you're trying to test that out in the market. Please note this is before product market fit. And for me, the clincher was when the founder of a brand said this specifically. And she said, I would not have shut my business down if you guys existed. This was a founder who just shut down her fashion brand. I had goosebumps that day. I have goosebumps right now as I'm speaking about it. It's just one of those visceral feelings for us, in that what we do actually not just keeps the lights and fans on for startups, for businesses, for brands, but it also creates a lot of downstream impact in local economies. A lot of these brands are local in nature. It's not just about employment. They actually impact downstream supply chains, which are local in nature. And that gives us the most joy, because everything is not designed for venture capital, I'd argue. In fact, not even for traditional debt. We have a sliver of our own that works very well for a spectrum of businesses. That gives us immense joy.
Right. Yeah, amazing to see that sort of missionary zeal with which you've started in this company, right? To me, revenue-based financing, the last mile complexity involved kind of baffles me actually, because on the supply side, hey, you have to go and partner with a bunch of folks. Yeah, who'd be happy to have this pipeline of good companies come to them for sure, right? But it's obviously not as simple as that. And then on the demand side, hey, if you're going to give money to people, they'll obviously take it. But then again, it's not as simple as that, right? So could you explain some of the nuances, the last mile complexity I'm talking about, right? I mean, some of the nuances for someone, let's say a layperson who perhaps thinks revenue based financing is as what I described, right? I mean, yeah, get some supply side partnerships and then yeah, hand out money basically.
Yeah, no, I mean, the good part or the fun part is that for a layperson, it should only be that complex. In fact, we fundamentally believe that our customers should not be forced with complexity. Our responsibility is to undertake all of that complexity and dish out a simple product, a simple workflow, a simple solution for them. Therein lies all the challenges, but let's speak about a few of those that you've mentioned, starting with something as simple as it's easy to give out money, but it is very hard to get it back, right? I mean, we're here in India as a market. We know how hard that is. There is so much of a cultural nuance to it. It's not like the Western markets where credit is very well preserved and protected from a legal and regulatory standpoint. Beyond a legal and regulatory standpoint, there is a different way of building a business also, which respects credit. Welcome to India, where credit is very poorly understood and then respected. All we know are bank loans. And that too, we are used to saying, oh, but what if we don't pay? We can default. Look at those guys. They have defaulted, and you can rattle out a bunch of names, one after the other. Just that cultural nuance of being able to collect money and then be able to give capital out and then be able to collect it requires a fair bit of infrastructure to be created. That infrastructure is one of our key IPs. Welcome to India, by the way. There was a power outage. That just made life a
Yeah.
little bit harder. Luckily, my
I was trying
internet
to
is on
understand what
UPS. My internet is on UPS, but other than that, everything is pretty much building that repayment infrastructure is fairly complex, and that is something that we invested in early on. We knew that getting the capital back at a high frequency is the best way to de-risk the business model, which is why there's a fair bit of tech IP around how can we collect the money back digitally at source at a high frequency. This is a nuance most people do not understand. Let me share this with an anecdote. During our last round, there was a US based investor who was doing our diligence, and they exposed us to another Western player in the same space. And that was a portfolio company. So they wanted to get a diligence done on Club. Now, this founder, when founder of revenue based financing company, by the way, he started understanding our business model. He goes midway in the call, but why have you built so much complexity? And our response was, welcome to India. We understand the challenges associated with scalability, but you have to understand that in markets like India, you have to operate very, very differently when you're getting capital back. And so that's just one of the nuances of building this and contextualizing this for the India market. But it's not just around repayments; it's also about risk. The way we do risk is very different. You can't look at classical lending the same way as revenue-based financing. In some ways, beyond credit, the differences start coming. We are in a very nuanced space of flow-based lending, and so that forces the entire business model, the underlying risk models, the underlying credit models to change, which again have to be built grounds up. Even the underlying technology stacks, what are called loan management systems, need to be built grounds up. So a lot of nuance that has gone into building this grounds up, specifically for the India market and specifically for the Asian markets, which we would not have undertaken if we were just copying blindly from Western playbooks.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like if you are able to build a business out here in India, I think you can build it anywhere in the world, right? There's just so much of complexity and everything here, and it's such a unique market as well. If you were to sort of abstract yourself away from this, 0 to 1 journey that you've done, what are 3 or 4 pointers that you would give to other founders who are perhaps executing in other domains?
Yeah, I think I will speak about advice that was given to me, which I still keep on going back. And these are collected from different places. So I'll speak about the three or four that come first to my mind. The first one comes from a dear friend and an investor. So, again, an investor turned operator, very smart gentleman. And I was very naive and early on in my entrepreneurial journey, and I was saying, here's how we will build it. This is what we're going to do. And in 5 to 7 years, we might even get acquired. And the guy just stops me midway. He says, hang on, you cannot build a business like that. Up until you're not thinking 10, 20, 30 years out, please don't do anything. Because it's only then when you start thinking of a different time horizon do you really start associating with the problem. I thought that was a very powerful thing to say, largely because we sometimes get into the narrative of thinking about flipping very quickly. We don't want to stick with the problem long enough, deep enough. And I think that forced me to change my perspective, saying, am I loving this problem so much that during the worst days, worst hours, when everything is going wrong in my professional, personal life, do I still think this makes sense to me? I thought that was a very, very good framework to
Interesting.
have. Another framework which started out early in the 0 to 1 journey, and this I'm going to take from a book now. This is Hard Things About Hard Things, Ben Horowitz. And I picked up a line that I literally wrote on my writing board at home, which was very, very useful during that 0 to 1 journey. Focus on the road, not the wall. And this is about a Formula One race driver, and they're obviously hurtling at enormous speeds. And it's something that is trained in their heads, which is focus on the road, not the wall. When you're doing 0 to 1, actually more things are going wrong than right. Anyone who says otherwise is bullshitting, pardon my French. The reason I say that is because while, of course, there are customers who like your product, there's an initial product market fit, nothing is built out for scale. Nothing is built out operationally. You're literally just hot wiring everything. You are patching everything. You're bandaging everything. At any moment, it looks like it's all going to go down in shambles. And during those rough phases, I think this made so much sense because we were trying to move at a very fast pace, and that allowed us to think about sticking with it over and over and over again. Another one comes from a dear mentor, and this also upended my thinking. It took me some time to unlearn that it's not about funding rounds that justifies the value of a business. We are so used to the media narrative about blah startup raising blah amount of capital that it's nearly hardwired us into thinking that startup success is about a funding round. Everything is wired around that. Your team members, potential employees, customer validation, market validation, media validation, heck, family validation, your own compensation. Everything is linked to the fact that you do well when there's a funding round. Not true. You do well when you build something of economic value that is going to be rewarded and that can scale profitably. Because if you cannot build something that is going to be economically rewarded and does not scale up profitably, there is no future for it. Yes, you could keep on doing a round of musical chairs, next round of investors, and next round of investors, and next round of investors. Yes, you might get secondaries along the way if that keeps your whatever happy, your family happy, or yourself happy, but your ego happy. But ultimately, it just boils down to building something economically viable that can scale up profitably. And the founder who gave me this advice uh, has been at it for many, many years, has built something of economic value. And he kept on saying, don't get lost into this next round blah valuation. And I can assure you as an investor, I was lost in that on that side. We, of course, are very, very specific and very particular about delivering value to our investors. Those who have backed us, those who have trusted in us, we want to make sure they get the best, the most outsized, the return and multi-bagger that they can get in their portfolio. We work very hard towards that, but the justification is not only saying, here's a paper money round that does value for you. It's not about that. So here are three anecdotes that come straight up to my mind.
This episode of the Startup Operator podcast is brought to you by Park Avenue. Now that we're all back at the office meeting colleagues and clients, it's time to ditch those PJs and look sharp with Park Avenue's range of 100% cotton, wrinkle-free shirts. They're super easy to maintain and keep you looking fresh through the day. So my fellow startup operators, visit the Park Avenue store on myraymond.com and check out the new wrinkle-free shirt collection. Let's get back to revenue-based financing itself. I would have kind of guessed that it would have been easier to do this, let's say, for enterprise SaaS or some kind of domain like that, right? I mean, obviously, net profitable businesses, and in some cases, it's recurring revenue. I mean, why pick consumer? Because, I mean, to me, when I look at it, consumer feels like, hey, a lot of spend initially to build a brand and get your acquisition channels working and so on. And it just feels a lot more complex, right? So any particular reason why you picked consumer specifically?
Yeah, two or three big reasons. The first, we were not trying to justify this for anyone. And I really mean this when I say this. A lot of times early on in the 0 to 1 journey, you are validating for the first set of investors. You are validating to them, for them, that this business model exists and that it will scale insanely well. A lot of time proxies are used, and in India we utilize proxies of Western markets. So whatever the companies in Western markets, even Chinese markets, let us just follow it and voila, everything will be solved. We were under no such pressure. We were under no such duress. We were not trying to appease anyone. The advantage of being a little older as an entrepreneur is you don't get swayed by sentiment. You start thinking more fundamentally about problems. And so that was one very big reason why everyone kept on arguing SaaS. We kept on thinking about it from a first principles basis, saying, yes, there are SaaS companies in India. The number of SaaS companies, and please note, this is circa 3 years back when we were just starting out, so market was slightly different then. Pretty much all SaaS companies, as they are scaling up, are selling into Western markets, largely US. As they're selling into US markets, their contracts are in US dollars. We are setting up in an India market where we will be raising capital in Indian rupees. Just matching the dollar offset of a contract that is in the US versus capital in India is not going to work. Second, how do you collect money back? Again, it sounds very simple as a problem, but that is the crux of the business. It's not about giving money, it's about collecting it back. How do you build something that gives money in India and collects it back in the US? It does not exist. You have to understand it's a very, very complex problem from a regulatory standpoint. And so there are again nuances associated with that made SaaS very unattractive. The third and the biggest reason is the following, which is we started out as a consumer brand. You have to realize that there is a problem statement that we associated with that we were trying to solve for. And revenue-based financing made sense. And it scaled up not just for a particular consumer vertical, it scaled up for other verticals also. And it's not that SaaS or B2B companies are out of scope for Klub. In fact, Klub works with a lot of SaaS companies, a lot of B2B companies with recurring revenue also. But it is built more gradually in terms of how each credit model, how each risk model is built, rather than saying, here's something out there in Western markets, let's go build it again. We wanted to solve a problem that is very near and dear to us. We are very glad that we are still solving that problem to this day.
So, what are some ways you are differentiating yourself as a lender? Because I don't think cash will ever become commodity, right? Especially not in India at this point. But if a company has 3 or 4 other options, why should they choose Klub?
The why to choose Klub starts becoming a little more complex, but I am going to simplify it along 7 dimensions that we think starts mattering to anyone raising capital. It's not in order of priority only. The first few obviously start mattering more, but it's an interplay of all of these put together when you're raising capital as a business. These parameters include quantum of capital, speed of capital, cost of capital, scalability of capital, tenure of capital, flexibility of capital, and value add of capital. Now, I've obviously thrown a lot of them, so let me just quickly simplify them. Quantum of capital, who can give me the largest amount of money in one shot? Speed of capital, who can give it to me quickly? Which process is simpler? Which process takes less time? The cost of capital, what does it really mean? What's the trade off in terms of what is that cost of financing or what is the valuation? The scalability of capital, is this going to scale up or is this a one time fee? Am I going to go round and round in circles again for the next amount of capital that I need to raise? Or can I depend on this partner to keep on going with me for a good duration? The tenure of capital, how long is it for or how short is it for? Depending on my use case, is it fitting what my needs are? The flexibility of capital, which is how flexible is it for me? Can I structure it? Can I move it around a little bit such that it becomes more purposeful for me? And last but not the least, the value add of capital, which is, are there other value adds that come with this particular capital, or is it only capital for capital's sake? We see a spectrum of all of these at play, with obviously more emphasis given on the first few, but anyone making a decision is indexing on these. Because I have broken them down in these order and in this interplay, we are always working to make sure that we are top of class in all of these dimensions, and obviously more so on the higher side as well. That's what we're solving for.
Right. And in terms of customer acquisition, I guess perhaps there are two routes you could take, right? I mean, one is perhaps the direct way, I mean, where startups or companies reach out to you directly. The other could be through, let's say, merchant partners and so on, where you sort of finance their purchase on that particular platform and so on. How have you seen both of these routes work out for you? And is there a third or a fourth route that I'm perhaps missing?
Sure. So, simple answer, we work on both at this point. And we absolutely believe that it is going to be a combination. But other than that, there are other forms of acquisition also. Some of it which are much simpler to say, some of which I won't be at liberty to share just as yet. The simpler ones to share are that we're no different from a SaaS business. In fact, our industry is called CAS, Capital as a Service, money on tap. So we think like SaaS businesses. We have funnels and we measure our funnels. There are different input channels for each funnel, and you can keep on evolving on those channels as well. In fact, there's a book called Traction, which is phenomenal. It has about 19 such channels called out. Think of us utilizing a combination of different tactics across each of these channels. They're obviously bucketed into a few for ease of internal simplicity and execution, but there are quite a few solutions that one can apply as a SaaS business to be able to acquire more customers.
Right. And we spoke about the nuances, right? The complexities and nuances. Lending is essentially a collections business, right? I mean, because it's perhaps more important to collect properly than to, hand out cash, as you mentioned earlier. What are some of the nuances of managing your balance sheet? From a very layperson's perspective, how do you sort of look at it? And can you give us an idea in terms of how that works?
Sure. I'd even go on, if I had to just go on a step before that, I'd even argue lending is a trust business. In fact, I'd argue all businesses are on trust. But you're right, if you start going back, yes, it's a collections business. It's a business of getting the capital back. What we did is that we took away the concept of balance sheet fundamentally, because we don't believe that balance sheet plays are the only ways or only solutions to build a lending business. So much so that I'd argue we don't think of ourselves as a lending company at all. We are in the business of financing growth, or rather, even enabling growth, not even financing growth. Enabling growth has multiple vectors, one of which is capital. Within capital, we are trying to understand how can capital drive incremental growth. For every $100 or 100 rupees of input capital, how can we get 400, 500 rupees of output revenue that we can take a share out of? So for us, when you start thinking of it differently, balance sheet is no longer the optimization function. I'd argue we don't think like a classical lender at all. We think like a tech data company. A balance sheet is one of the ways to be able to get to the end. So it's a means to end, it is not the end for us. So, much to the chagrin of of a few investors, we are not building a balance sheet today. It is just one of the components in the marketplace. We do think that need to be other pools of capital, largely because as businesses scale, their needs for capital evolve and one has to keep up with it. And last but not the least, we are not in the business of lending. We are in the business of enabling growth, capital being one of the verticals which does that, and we will launch more verticals that drive this core thematic point.
Awesome. Could you talk about some of those other vectors perhaps that will come up in the next maybe 4, 5, 10 years?
And that's exactly what I cannot speak about. I apologize for that one. That's the tricky one, in that hopefully in 2023, you will start seeing some of them. You will start hearing about some of them. But it goes back to the same thing, in that there is so much more to be done. When we started building the business, we could literally extrapolate it out 30 years out also. And we're just starting out. It's 3 years out of 30, maybe even more.
Awesome. So, yeah, I mean, we're looking forward to that, at the edge of our seats, waiting for the other stuff to come. You operate in a very complex regulatory environment as well, right? I mean, you've seen, for example, what RBI did with the BNPL folks right now, right? Has completely put a spanner in the works for those businesses as such, right? I wonder, how do you manage this whole regulatory side of things? How much of your attention do you pay to it? And are there any principles or hacks that you sort of realized over the course of running Klub that could be useful for others as well in similar circumstances?
Yes, absolutely. And I want to be absolutely unambiguous about it, which is, don't think through hacks. It is just the wrong way of thinking about regulation. Don't think about managing them only. Regulation is not created only to, a perception that goes on is that regulation is created to create an impediment,
As
to
a
create a
hindrance.
roadblock. It's an hindrance. Oh, look at them. Look at the regulators. They are not pro business. They are not friendly. If one thinks deeply, much like we were speaking about, investors and entrepreneurs as two sides of the table, I will actually say that regulation and regulators end up becoming another dimension to the table. And the one thing that good entrepreneurs do and smart entrepreneurs do that I've seen in my life is that they take it with as much seriousness. They pay attention to it. Some of the paying attention only happens when obviously they are shaken out, or they're absolutely shaken up by something that comes left field. But a lot of them that I know of, the smart ones especially, they actually keep accounting for regulation as one of the dimensions that enables business. And when you think of regulation enabling business, you again start thinking very differently. You are managing it, but managing it from a standpoint of how can you truly do something that will scale up well and that will become kosher, or is kosher and will become kosher. You can't have halfways about it. You can't have your cake and eat it too on that argument, and definitely not in fintech and financing. Enough and more people will obviously be there to throw big brickbats as well. Enough and more love throwing stones at glass houses, saying, oh, look how brittle they are. Fintech is supposed to operate at what one would call the fringes of innovation and regulation. Right? So you're sitting at that fringe. You're trying to push the boundaries of what can and cannot be done. And so enough and more people will say, oh, those guys are doing something wrong. I'd argue actually a lot of businesses are not doing something wrong. It's because regulation is not stated clearly. There is an interpretation that is being made. Incorrect interpretations should always be culled out, but as long as there is an interpretation, it is fine. The job of regulation is to always make the gray into a black or a white. So we are very pro regulation because if anything, it is forcing clarity on you. So you know what to do and what you cannot do. If business gets to know what it can do and cannot do, it can always evolve around it. But if you tell me that things are gray, that's a problem, because then I don't know what to do. And it's only in the grays that you have shadow economies, you have all sorts of speed money, you have people who are lobbyists who are always trying to figure out what can and cannot be done. There's a lot of back channeling. Clarity is always good. And so if you have your eye out as to where the regulator is headed, then you can always build a business in that direction. So we were always clear, again, I say this 3 years back, we always anticipated that some of regulation that we see today is going to come. And because we were always clear that it would come, it didn't take us by surprise at all. In fact, we welcome it as much as is possible because clarity always helps. And so, to anyone who's thinking about doing anything in a regulated business, absolutely go for it. You can't ignore it. You just have to keep your eyes at it. You have to pay attention. You have to see the directionality, and don't muck around in things that the regulator does not like or does not want you to do. That is spelled out very, very clearly. You should have team members who are able to actually read guidelines, not lawyers who are interpreting it for you. And that's probably one of the strengths of the club teams. We actually go in and read circulars, we can read regulation. I have team members who at times can interpret far better than even lawyers. And so we have debates with legal teams that help us get a lot more clearer. But it's not secondhand knowledge, it's not secondhand interpretations only.
Right. Yeah, that makes total sense, right? Because God knows there is so much of ambiguity, in running a startup anyway, right? I mean, you don't want the added ambiguity of the whole regulatory ambit as well, right? And I've heard similar things from other founders as well who operate in fintech or healthcare as well. That the regulatory bodies just come out and say what is kosher, right? What can be done, what can't be done, and they're happy to sort of stick by that. And also, I mean, sort of respecting this and being proactive on this means that you will sort of play this on the front foot, right? I mean, and not be defensive and not be cagey when some kind of an eventual regulation happens. Yeah, so I think that's such an important point. Between 2021 and now, right? I mean, we're seeing like a stark difference in terms of the macro environment, right? I mean, we had this unbridled optimism in 2021, and right now, we're kind of facing the funding winter, so to speak. How does a founder keep an even keel in these times? How do you sort of look at the road, as you mentioned, right? And not look at the wall, not be blinded by all of the stuff that's happening on the sidelines. What is your advice for executing during a slowdown?
So, two or three parts to it. I think the main question is executing in a slowdown. But before that, I do have a few perspectives, which is what goes up must come down, what goes down must go up, right? So, if you spend enough years, you know that these are macro trends that always have counterintuitive effects. There is a lot of whiplash that exists, and now with information symmetry increasing, with more and more people becoming aware of the same piece of information in a short duration of time, the whiplash effect is higher. And at the same point in time, what is the depth of that? What is the stickiness of that information is always up for debate. So we've always heard this as well, that when things are optimistic, everyone becomes optimistic. When they're pessimistic, everyone becomes pessimistic. Being even keeled, as you rightly said, is something that one has to have as one of the dimensions, while another dimension is again very counterintuitive in that you have to play the wave and you have to play the tide also as an entrepreneur. So these are these counterintuitive things, and I call it above the fold and below the fold a little bit. Above the fold, you have to play the wave, you have to play the tide. But below the
Could you,
fold,
yeah, could you
as a
talk about that?
sportsman,
Could you talk about
sure.
that a little bit, please? I mean, because I kind of understand this, right? I mean, like, when you trade or invest, I mean, obviously people say that, hey, the market can remain irrational or exuberant longer than you are solvent, right? And so you have to sort of respect, you have to respect that. What is the equivalent of that as a founder? Because I think that's extremely interesting, what you said, which is riding the wave.
Yeah. So ultimately, one has to understand that there are different stakeholders at play in business. It includes your customers, it includes investors, it includes team members, it includes market sentiment or market perception, and each of them is, think of it as a wave, right? I mean, you have to ace each one of them. Sometimes all of them simultaneously in a huge tidal wave or whatever that be. But knowing that there are themes on which a lot of decisions are done or taken is important to understand. It's the same way that you will hear of macro theme, like lending is hot, lending is not hot. I mean, I don't know what's hot or not hot. If you take a 10, 20, 30-year view out, everything is being through multiple cycles of hot and not. But when you're in a hot phase, as one would assume by some of the stakeholders that we just elucidated, when are you able to capitalize on that goodness and build growth and momentum? But at the same point in time, when you're in a down phase of a wave, when you still have not peaked, you are actually you're riding towards the wave, then are you getting everything right in your DNA, in your operations, in your team, in your philosophy to be able to ride that wave that is going to come also? This is usually a tricky one because this only boils down to having adequate resources. Resources includes money, resources includes time, resources includes mental bandwidth. That's it. If you have a combination of these three, you can keep on working long enough up until you reach that next wave or the set of waves or all one ginormous tidal wave that comes together. But you have to keep sort of these two things, as I said, above the fold, which is knowing that there are these waves that you have to work towards. But below the wave, which I think is going to get quasi philosophical, is that you have to be consistent no matter what. You have to consistently keep building. You have to consistently keep hustling. You have to consistently keep trying. You have to consistently keep selling. Nothing changes. Nothing changes whatsoever. Good turn, bad turn, downturn, upturn, no idea. But the life of entrepreneurs, I'd argue the life of senior leadership team members, is somewhat impervious to this. You're always building, you're always selling, and that's below the fold activity that has to go regardless.
Fantastic. So before we wind this up, Anurakt, any books or podcasts that you would kind of recommend? I would hazard a guess and say The Hard Thing About Hard Things is one of your recommendations, and in fact, I mean that's one of the most recommended books on the podcast. Are there anything else that the audience should look out for?
Actually, I was not going to say The Hard Things About Hard Things, interestingly, but that's a phenomenal book. I think there are some great books that everyone should read, regardless of whether you're an entrepreneur, you're in a startup or not. My books are kind of a little weird and esoteric, but I will speak about these ones. I think there's a recent book that has come out that is doing quite well, The Courage to be Disliked. It's about a line of philosophy that is taking a different take on Freudian philosophy. And I think that's very interesting. It's very interesting because ultimately we have to make our organizations more objective such that we leave them in a better place than when we started or when we entered them. And I think that's a phenomenal book that speaks about individual biases. Another book that I recommend to a lot of people, which is again a very weird book by the title, but is a phenomenal book to read, is a book that won the Pulitzer by the name of The Denial of Death. We as human beings keep running away from the one existential fact, our death. In fact, all of our creations are to discount that one existential truth. And I think it's a phenomenal read about identifying who you are as a person and what you want to be in the limited time that one has, which I think is another different take. But yeah, those would be two that I would recommend. Books in general, I say there are no bad books at all. Just keep reading, and there's always so much stuff to discover. You can always discount what you don't like.
Yeah. Absolutely. Hey, this has been an awesome chat, awesome chat, and yeah, I mean, I'm so glad that we could finally do this. Thank you again for being on the podcast and sharing your wisdom. I'm sure that it will be super helpful to all of the listeners. So thank you, Anurakt, for your time.
My pleasure as well, Roshan. Thank you so much for having me over. All the very best to everyone who's listening to this, and thank you once again. Take care.
In the Park Avenue PowerPoint segment, we review some of the highlights of this conversation. Anurakt talks about how building a business is not just about the concept, it is about scaling that business into a viable economic opportunity. You could brute force 0 to 1 to perhaps even 10, but 10 to 100 requires a mature operational mindset in order for you to be able to scale people, product, or processes. On advice for other founders, Anurakt says, don't start a business until you're ready to stick with a problem for long enough, and that funding rounds do not justify the valuation of a business. Building something of economic value that can scale profitability is what justifies that. On dealing with regulations, fintech, he says, operates at the fringe of regulation and innovation. A regulator's job is to make the gray into black or white. Regulation is good because it offers a lot more clarity to founders on what they can and cannot do. And finally, on operating in a downturn, founders need to keep selling and keep building regardless of whether the markets trend up or down. Over a long enough time, there'll be many such cycles. Well, that's it, folks. I hope you liked this podcast. It had a lot of insights in here that you could apply in your business. Don't forget to rate and review us. It really helps a lot more people discover all of this awesome content. I'll see you again on another episode of the Startup Operator podcast with another amazing guest.